Today's episode is brought to you by Playmates Toys. Dune Part 2's biggest changes and ending explained. What is up, my Dunes? Dune Part 2, aka Tune, is finally out in theaters, and man oh man is it spicy. We've done a recap of Dune Part 1, which you can find the link for in the description below, but now that the second half of the story of Dune is out, there are a lot of details to break down and discuss, especially the ending and some of the major differences between the movie and the book. So today, we're here to explain anything you might have missed and how Dune Part 2's ending can affect the Dune franchise moving forward. Now, before we get too far ahead with our prescience, we want to remind you that Nerdist pays royal tithes to Legendary Pictures, which produces Dune Parts 1 and 2. But hopefully by now, you know that I have been a fan of Dune for quite a while, and I've been drinking that water of life Kool-Aid my entire life. So I would be talking about Dune anyways. So with that said, let's dive in, and if you haven't seen Dune Part 2 yet, or even Part 1 for that matter, consider this your spoiler warning. If you don't want to open this can of sandworms now, it's time to say bye, Halud. Okay, let's catch up to where Dune Part 1 ends and where Part 2 begins. We last saw Paul Atreides and his mother, Jessica, joining the Fremen as they journey into the deserts of Arrakis. The two had previously escaped a brutal attack by their archenemies, House Harkonnen.
They're brutal!
House Atreides had been charged with governorship of the planet Arrakis to manage the harvest of the most precious resource in the universe, the spice melange. Spice gives you long life, it allows the Spacing Guild to travel through space, and it gives you prescient visions, especially if your name is Paul. But the Emperor had been threatened by the Atreides' popularity among the royal houses, and he secretly plotted with the Harkonnens to destroy House Atreides entirely. Paul and Jessica escaped this ambush and then turned to the Fremen to help them survive on this hostile world. And Dune Part 2 picks up right where Part 1 ends. We immediately see that the same group of Fremen are transporting Jamis' body after he had challenged Paul to a duel at the end of Part 1. And here's where Part 2 begins its first major departure from the source material. During Paul and Jessica's time with the Fremen, book readers were expecting a 2-ish year time jump, giving Paul enough time to learn the ways of the Fremen and become a leader among them. But Dune's director, Denis Villeneuve, explained in Entertainment Weekly that he wanted to keep the pressure of time slipping away from Paul throughout this adaptation. This compression of Paul's journey accelerates his rise to power and also raises a question about when his younger sister Alia will be born. But we'll get back to Alia in just a little bit. The first half of Dune Part 2 focuses on Paul's journey as the Fremen adopt him as one of their own. The movie gives us more time than in the book to truly see how Paul's relationship with Chani grows, and we are given a greater perspective of Paul through Chani herself. Chani reminds us that Paul is still an outsider, still a stranger to the deserts of her home world. In stark contrast, Stilgar views Paul as the Mahdi, his prophesized messiah. Paul learns the ways of the desert from both Chani and Stilgar, ultimately culminating in Paul becoming a Fremen warrior, known as a Fedaykin, gaining a Fremen name, Paul Muad'Dib Usul, and finally riding one of the giant sandworms. But as Paul's popularity among the Fremen grows, his mother Jessica continues stoking the flames of prophecy to cement her son as a messiah. Remember, back in Dune Part 1, we learned of the Bene Gesserit's Missionaria Protectiva, their plan of spreading false myths and religions on planets that any Bene Gesserit sister could use as a way to control entire peoples. Jessica has used her Bene Gesserit training to become a Reverend Mother, and she manipulates the Fremen to believe Paul is the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world. Talk about a real ornithopter parent, am I right? Thanks. Paul, meanwhile, leads the Fremen in a guerrilla war against the Harkonnens to interrupt their spice harvesting. And the rest of the Imperium has definitely noticed how this rogue Fremen prophet has upset the Harkonnens' prophet. Unbeknownst to the Emperor and the major houses of the Landsraad, this Fremen leader known as Muad'Dib is actually Paul Atreides. The Reverend Mother Mohiam of the Bene Gesserit, however, realizes that Paul, and Jessica as well, have stepped far beyond the bounds that the sisterhood can allow. She decides to focus on another part of her breeding program, the vicious Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen. Feyd-Rautha, the hairless Harkonnen heir, takes control of Arrakis and leads a new counteroffensive against the Fremen. So brutal,
they're brutal,
that Paul must take drastic measures. He sees flashes of visions where Chani is harmed in his war with the Harkonnens. The only way for Paul to gain enough prescient sight and find a way to defeat his enemies is to drink the deadly water of life. The water of life is a concentrated form of spice essence from the bile of a drowned baby sandworm. Gross. By processing the poison within him, he can unlock his full powers to see all of space and time. But along with all of this, Paul must also embrace his role in the Fremen religion if he is to unite all of the Fremen behind him and fight the Harkonnens. Paul must also assume his title of Duke again so that he has the political standing to challenge the Imperium. Paul becomes the Kwisatz Haderach, the Lisan al-Gaib, the Fremen's Mahdi, and the Duke of Arrakis, and then finally leads the Fremen in a climactic battle against the Emperor and his Sardaukar. Paul seizes the throne from the Emperor by demanding the Princess Irulan's hand in marriage, and the Fremen begin their holy war against the Imperium. And so the good guys win, right?
No!
Hold on a second. Let's back up a little bit and look again at the plot of Dune Part 2, how this adaptation streamlined the plot of the original novel, and how it focused on the important message at the end of this part of Paul's story. But first, let's note some of the minor changes, including some of the characters that didn't make the cut. For instance, after Paul defeats Jamis, Jamis's wife, Hara, and their sons Orlop and Khalif also become part of the Atreides household. You know, Orlop and Khalif, son of Jeff, who was then adopted by Jamis. But this aspect of Fremen culture is not a part of the movie. Fingers crossed that we'll get to see Jamis's coffee pot, however, in a Dune Messiah movie. We also don't see Count Casimir Fenring, husband to Lady Margot Fenring, played by Léa Seydoux in the film. Count Fenring was a close friend to the Emperor and was the temporary governor of Arrakis between the Harkonnens and the Atreides. Fenring was also a failed candidate to be the Kwisatz Haderach, and when given a chance to kill Paul, he relents and accepts Paul as superior. Another minor character not used in the film is Leto II, the true Leto II, if you know what I'm talking about. Many fans were wondering if we would see Paul and Chani's first child, a boy named after Paul's father. In the trailers, we saw Chani don a blue scarf, a Nizoni scarf that signifies a woman has given birth to a son, and that she is married or romantically involved with someone. Due to the shorter time frame of the movie, Paul and Chani don't have the time to have a baby, but Chani still wears it as a symbol of her love for Paul. She still wears it in the final battle, but this might have also just been a choice to help easily identify her among other Fremen warriors. Regardless, just like another family with a prescient son, in the Atreides household, we don't talk about Leto.
Every time.
And finally, our favorite Mentat and master of assassins, Thufir Hawat, was also removed from this movie, leading audiences to believe he could have possibly died in the Battle of Arrakeen. In the book, the Harkonnens capture Thufir to replace their dead Mentat, Piter de Vries. Thufir is forced to serve the Harkonnens, but constantly schemes and pits Feyd-Rautha against Baron Harkonnen. Denis has explained he wanted his films to focus more on the Bene Gesserit than the Mentats in the Dune universe. So I'm just waiting for a Heretics of Dune movie when we can meet the GOAT, the Mentat Miles Teg. Now on to some more major plot changes. Since Dune Part 1 didn't focus heavily on the traitorous Dr. Yue subplot, Lady Jessica was never under suspicion of being a Harkonnen spy. After Gurney reunited with Paul in the desert, Gurney had no way of knowing the true identity of the Harkonnen spy and still suspected Jessica. In the book, Gurney attempts to kill Jessica until Paul explains who the real traitor was. And because Paul never foresaw this deadly threat to his mother, he decides then to take the Water of Life to increase his prescient vision of the future. Instead, Dune Part 2 increases the presence of the Atreides family atomics. Once Feyd-Rautha unleashes his brutal attacks, and Paul has visions of his nuclear arsenal harming Chani, Paul realizes he must take the Water of Life to see far enough into the future to find ways to defeat his enemies and save his Sihaya. Paul still uses his nuclear warheads later on, but mostly as a threat to destroy all of the spice fields on the entire planet. In the book, Paul threatens to upset the life cycle of the sandworms by using the Water of Life and to set off a chain reaction to kill all of spice production. The concept of he who can destroy a thing has the real control of it still remains true in the movie. But let's move on to probably the largest addition to the original book, the expansion of many of the female characters and their impact on Paul's life. As Denis Villeneuve stressed in interviews, he wanted his films to focus on the women in Dune and the power they wield over the story. The first major change is the use of Chani's friend, Shishakli. In the book, Shishakli is actually a male Fremen, mentioned only once, and all he does is just let Paul borrow his maker hooks to ride his first sandworm. In the film, however, Shishakli gives the audience a perspective on both Paul and Chani. Shishakli sees Paul as a foreigner, and she is one of the Fremen who doesn't see Paul as the promised Messiah in Fremen legend. Chani also views Paul in this same light at first.
I don't believe you're the Lisan al-Gaib.
But through Chani, we learn of Paul's genuine desire to join the Fremen. In the book, Chani quickly believes in Paul's myth. But in the film, she remains one of the few to see who he really is, reminding him that he is still foreign to the ways of the desert. She warns him to stay true to himself, but as Paul descends into darkness, Chani remains as a voice of reason for the audience.
This prophecy is how they enslave us!
She serves as a stark contrast to the fundamentalist Fremen of the South, especially Stilgar. Stilgar's fanaticism is played for laughs in many moments in the film, but underneath his enthusiasm for the Lisan al-Gaib lies the dangerous side of blind faith that Frank Herbert aims to warn us about. Chani too celebrates Paul's achievements, but she recognizes when fanaticism affects her people, like when the Fremen begin praying after Paul rides his first sandworm. Next up is quite a big change and a surprise to many Dune fans: Paul's younger sister, Alia Atreides. While waiting for Dune Part 2, every book reader was anxious to see just how we would finally meet our favorite murder toddler with a knife. In Dune Part 1, flashes of Paul's prescient visions reveal that Jessica is secretly pregnant with a daughter, and we see a quick shot of a baby born with the blue eyes of Ibad. Since Dune Part 2 removes the time jump from the book, fans were wondering just how long it would take for Jessica to give birth to Alia, and how much Alia would grow up before the movie's end. By the end of the book, Alia is a toddler, but because of Jessica taking the water of life while pregnant, Alia is a young child with full adult awareness and all of the memories of her ancestors. Casting a 2-year-old who can talk like an adult would be pretty difficult to pull off, and Twilight Breaking Dawn showed us that a CGI baby isn't the best idea. But Dune Part 2 captures the horrifying side of a mother and her fully aware fetus. Like Paul, Alia has prescience and can communicate with her brother through time. She too sees a path forward and helps guide the way for the Kwisatz Haderach. The difference with Alia, however, is that she is pre-born, with no time for her young mind and body to establish her own sense of self, making her more susceptible to becoming overwhelmed by the plethora of past lives in her genetic memory. Pre-born such as Alia are known as abominations. As Paul takes the water of life, he sees one of his clearest visions yet, into a possible future years from now. A young Fremen marches among the dunes of Arrakis to find an ocean with waves lapping away at the sand. Open water on Arrakis, the dream of Dr. Kynes, and the beginning of transforming the planet from an arid wasteland into a lush paradise. The Fremen have dreamt and worked towards terraforming Dune, and Paul's path will only accelerate this change. Finally, the Fremen turns to address Paul, and we see that it is actually Alia, played by Anya Taylor-Joy. She assures Paul that everything she is doing is out of love for her brother. And this moment is magical and horrifying and creepy all at the same time. How much of Paul's path is his decision? Are the actions of others pushing him on a predetermined path? Do Alia's prescient visions differ from Paul's? Anya Taylor-Joy's cameo has been one of the best kept secrets for such a monumental film. If we get a movie adaptation of Dune's sequel, Dune Messiah, we will get to see Anya Taylor-Joy have a lot of fun with one of my favorite characters in the entire Dune saga. And while we wait to see more Alia in a potential Dune Messiah movie, we'll at least have Furiosa in May for ATJ to wield some real desert power. Now, let's talk about Jessica, and what is probably my favorite implication from the whole movie. Dune Part 2 finally gives us the big reveal of Jessica's parentage.
You can't know that.
Or at least half of it. To become a Reverend Mother, Jessica had to drink the water of life, which unlocked her genetic memories of all of her female ancestry. An antiquated theory in psychology, genetic memory is the idea that memories can be inherited from your ancestors, stored in the DNA that is passed into your genetic makeup. Once Paul drank the water of life, since he was the Kwisatz Haderach, he could unlock not only his female ancestry, but the male line of ancestors as well. Paul then learns that his maternal grandfather is none other than the Baron Harkonnen himself. Jessica admits that she learned this fact when she herself processed the water of life earlier in the movie. For those who don't know, the Bene Gesserit train many young women from the noble houses, but a large portion of the Bene Gesserit adepts are raised by the Sisterhood without knowledge of their real parents or family. This Bene Gesserit practice allows the Sisterhood to proceed with their breeding program and to intermingle bloodlines however they please. Gross. Jessica is just another piece in the Bene Gesserit breeding program and is one of the adepts who never knew her true parentage. In the book, while Paul and Jessica are still hiding in their still tent in the desert, Paul's budding prescient visions and his mentat abilities reveal to him that his mother is actually the Baron Harkonnen's daughter. Jessica was born as part of the Bene Gesserit schemes to harness the Harkonnen bloodline, to then give birth to an Atreides daughter, who would then have been married to a Harkonnen heir, and then it would have been they who give birth to the true Kwisatz Haderach.
You were told to bear only daughters, but you in your pride thought you could produce the Kwisatz Haderach.
Dune Part 1 saved this reveal for Part 2, to show that Paul must still discover some of the darkness within him. But now that we know about Jessica's father, what do we know about her mother? Let's look at that final moment between Reverend Mother Jessica and Reverend Mother Mohiam. They seem to communicate telepathically, and while many of the Bene Gesserit abilities are both powerful and sometimes confusing, Bene Gesserit sisters are not telepathic. The 1984 Dune film, directed by David Lynch, only added to this confusion.
Get out of my mind!
So, how could Jessica hear Mohiam's voice inside her head? When a Reverend Mother unlocks all of her female ancestral memories, she can communicate with all of her past female relatives. Therefore, a form of Mohayim lives inside Jessica's genetic memory, because Mohayim is actually Jessica's mother. Mohayim even admits to Irulan and Margot earlier in the film that she is a maternal figure, and it would make sense that she is just as much of the Kwisatz Haderach breeding program as Jessica is.
Kwisatz Haderach.
And before the expanded novels by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson explicitly put this theory to rest, this idea was heavily implied in the appendices of Dune. And believing that Mohayim is actually Jessica's mother makes Jessica even more interesting, at least to me. Jessica's rebellion against the Bene Gesserit only makes Jessica more of a badass. And finally, we come to the final shot of the movie and what it could mean for the story of Dune in the future. In the book, Paul still defeats Feyd-Rautha and usurps the Golden Lion throne away from Shaddam IV by forcing Princess Irulan into marriage. The Reverend Mother Jessica then turns to Chani and explains, "Think on it, Chani. That princess will have the name, yet she'll live as less than a concubine, never to know a moment of tenderness from the man to whom she is bound. While we, Chani, we who carry the name of concubine, history will call us wives." Just like Jessica never married Duke Leto for political reasons, Chani will never marry Paul. I always interpreted this final line as Jessica consoling Chani that she need not worry. Paul will always love her, and historians will look back upon this time and see how just important Chani and Jessica were to the mythology of Paul Atreides. But in a wonderful interview between my pal Max Every and Denis Villeneuve for Den of Geek, Villeneuve explains that this final line of the book would have reduced the roles of the women in Dune too much in his adaptation of the story. And if Chani had come to accept her place as only Paul's concubine, we would not have gotten Chani's unique perspective. Because with the wonderful expansion of Chani's role in Dune Part 2, we get an important bookend to complement the beginning of Dune Part 1. Chani is our first introduction to Arrakis in Part 1. She shows how oppressive any of the elite class of noble houses view her planet, merely as a resource to be harvested and a piece to be played in the political games of the Imperium. And by the end of Dune Part 2, Chani realizes she has only enabled the next oppressor to wield her home planet to gain power. While Paul still promises to love Chani as long as he breathes, Chani is rightly upset that Paul publicly announces his love for Irulan. Paul can claim that by doing this, he is following the best path forward for the Fremen and for Arrakis, but he still remains a part of the oppressive powers that the Fremen rebel against. He's not destroying the Imperium, he's only replacing it with a new empire under his control. The new power dynamics between Paul, Chani, and Irulan all play out in a beautiful sequence of shots near the end, showing each character's point of view of the others and how separate Chani is from the political world of Paul and Irulan. And as the Fremen take their warships to launch their holy war across the Imperium, an angered Chani marches off into the desert to summon a sandworm. And that's it. That's how the movie ends. And if you thought it was pretty abrupt, well, that's the point. Frank Herbert built the story of Dune slowly, only to rush into a campy ending of a final sword fight between the hero and a villain, and then the hero wins the day and becomes king. Herbert strongly believed that the difference between a hero and an anti-hero is where you stop the story. For Herbert, Dune is where he decided to stop Paul's story for now. So if that's just the ending of the story for now, it makes us wonder what we could see in a potential adaptation of Dune's sequel, Dune Messiah, for a third Dune movie, which Denis Villeneuve has said he wants to make. Now, another spoiler warning here in case you haven't read Dune Messiah. I'll give some general overview of some of the important plot points, but if you haven't read it yet, go take a break, come back here when you're done. It's pretty short. Also, it's my favorite of the Dune books.
My road leads into the desert. I can see it.
A major thread in Dune Messiah is the need for an heir to Paul. 12 years have passed since Paul has unleashed his holy war across the known universe. He refuses to love Irulan, and their marriage remains solely a political one. At the same time, Paul remains loyal to his Sihaya, Chani. Irulan, however, has been secretly feeding Chani contraceptives in the hope that Paul will finally turn to Irulan for a child, thereby also having a child that would fall back into the hands of the Bene Gesserit. Chani remains insistent on giving Paul an heir, so much so that it leads to a very tragic end. But what could turn the Chani from the end of Dune Part 2 into a Chani willing to put her life on the line for Paul in Dune Messiah? Now that House Atreides has claimed power and has united with House Carino, an heir from Irulan would ensure that Arrakis and the Imperium would remain under control of yet another oppressor. Chani may want to ensure that if Paul does have an heir, that his child at least be of Fremen heritage, therefore returning Arrakis to its indigenous people. Another aspect of Chani's rejection of Paul at the end of Part 2 is that it foreshadows much of the descent against Paul's new empire. Dune Part 2 shows the difference between the Fremen of the Northern Hemisphere and the religious fanatics of the Southern Hemisphere. Dune Messiah would only show those differences grow between Paul's loyal priests and the Fremen disillusioned by 12 years of holy wars. But Chani and the Fremen stories are just a few among the many plot lines in Dune Messiah. Again, I highly recommend reading it, especially right after finishing Dune, and I promise you'll have a good time. Also, when you read Dune Messiah, you'll never be able to watch Star Wars Revenge of the Sith the same way ever again.
Babies.
And also The Matrix Revolutions.
I can see you.
Anyways, folks, that's everything you need to know about the ending of Dune Part 2. And we're keeping our fingers crossed over here at Nerdist while we wait for a potential adaptation of Dune Messiah. And then maybe a Children of Dune adaptation, and then maybe God Emperor of Dune, then Heretics of Dune, and Chapter House Dune. I know at least one person that would be very excited. Thank you again to Playmates Toys for sponsoring today's show. Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire is almost here, and now you can recreate your favorite MonsterVerse moments with Playmates Toys' awesome line of movie figures. The Epic Collection includes everything from Kong with his battle-ready beast glove, to Godzilla evolved with his signature heat ray, to an adorable Zuko and the fan-favorite Titanus Doug. To learn more about how you can get your hands on Godzilla, Kong, the nefarious Scar King, and more, head to playmatestoys.com or click the link in the description below. But tell us, what do you think about Dune Part 2? What do you think about future Dune sequels?
This is only the beginning.
Let us know in the comments below, and for all things spicy in the world of Dune and pop culture, we've got you covered over on Nerdist.com.